Good afternoon, and thank you for joining today's webinar. My name is Matthew Jane, and I'm the Learning and Engagement Manager for the State Historical Society of Iowa. The Iowa History 101 webinars, presented on the second Thursdays of each month, explore Iowa's history from pre-statehood to current day. You can learn more about this series and all of our programs on our website at history.iowa.gov. Please remember to sign up for each webinar you would like to attend, and don't worry if you can't watch live. All presentations will be recorded. Now, a few housekeeping points before I introduce our speaker. Everyone came into this webinar on mute with cameras off. Closed captions are available by clicking the closed caption button on your screen. The webinar is being recorded and will be placed on the Iowa History page of YouTube in a few days. I've disabled the chat function, but if you have any questions, please type them into the Q&A feature throughout the webinar today. My colleague Andrew Klump is watching that feature, and he will prepare a list of questions for the speaker at the end of the presentation. But please note we may not have time to get to all the questions. Also, a few days following the program, a thank you email will be sent, which includes a list of additional readings and resources for you to check out in your own time. Now, I'm pleased to introduce our presenter, Cindy Wilson. Minnesotan Cindy Wilson has done extensive research related to the construction of the Dakota Central Railroad line and the history of the hard winter of 1880 to 81. Her award-winning books are The Beautiful Snow, about the hard winter of 1880-81, and We Suffered Much, The Adventures of the Surveyor Who Decided Where to Put the Railroad from Tracy to Pierre, and thus the creation of De Smet. Her works have been published in the Chicago Northwestern Historical Society Quarterly Magazine, as well as the South Dakota Historical Society Quarterly Journal, among others. She is a regular contributor to Laura's Corner, published in the Kingsbury Journal newspaper in De Smet, South Dakota. In addition to being an Ingalls Wilder Lane researcher and writer, she's active in the world of Frank Lloyd Wright. She leads tours at the Frank Lloyd Wright designed Stockman House in Mason City, Iowa, and her most recent book is about that house and can be purchased on shopiowa.com. Cindy gives frequent talks about material from her first two books, and this talk will focus on We Suffered Much, which follows a Dakota Central Railroad survey conducted by Iowa City native Charles Wood Irish. And now I'm very happy to turn over to Cindy to begin today's webinar. Cindy, you are muted.
I knew I'd do that. Thank you, Matthew, for reminding me that. And thank you for the invitation. And thank you to everybody who's here today. I'm excited to be on Iowa History 101 and talking about a little known slice of history that has a strong Iowa connection. There's a great deal known about the impact that railroads had on changing the face of America for both good and bad during the 19th century. And we also know quite a bit about the construction of those routes, mostly based on the frequency of newspaper articles that kept the readers breathlessly up to date with the progress of construction and the opportunities that the rails represented. However, with just a few exceptions, there's very little known about the surveying of these lines. Now, surveying itself is a technical process, and don't worry, that's not at all what I'm going to be talking about today. And it's not what my book is about. Instead, it's the people who did the surveying and the experiences they had. That's the story. And my focus today is on a branch of the Chicago and Northwestern called the Dakota Central that eventually produced new towns in Dakota Territory, such as Brookings, De Smet, Huron, and even Pierre. And
Cindy, you have muted again.
I do not know how that one happened. Sorry about that.
You're back. No worries.
So the story of this 2.5-year project is much too big to compress into a talk. So I'm just going to be sharing a few things today. First, I'll talk about why I was drawn to these diaries and letters in the first place. Then some context for why Irish was doing this survey. I'm going to introduce you to him and his family. And then I'm going to share some vignettes from the project. And then I will end with a research triumph that began with idle curiosity and then got a little bit out of hand from there. So how did I end up digging around in the letters and the diaries of a railroad surveyor of all things? Well, My first book was a deep dive into the history of the hard winter of 1880-81. And for those unfamiliar, the hard winter was a particularly vicious season on the northern plains when the first blizzard struck in mid-October and the storms came with relative frequency until mid-April. And that is also the winter that Laura Ingalls Wilder wrote about in her novel, The Long Winter. And as a part of the research for this first book, I just wanted to know where Irish and his crew were when that first blizzard of the winter struck in October. And reading his diaries, I was able to figure that out. And that's all I needed for the first book. But when I started digging into his project deeper, I got really curious about a few things. So that's how I ended up digging around in his diaries. Now, a bit of context for why this survey was happening in the first place. In 1873, the Chicago and Northwestern had reached what today is Watertown, South Dakota. And the next goal, once they had gotten into Dakota Territory, was to extend the tracks to the northwest to connect to the Northern Pacific, which was a transcontinental that was under construction at this time. And the plan was that would connect the two coasts by way of the Great Lakes, and then tracks would head west from the harbor at Duluth, Minnesota. And in September of 1873, railroad officers and major businessmen were on an excursion to the end of those new rails at Watertown, celebrating the opportunity and the riches they were envisioning for themselves. But while they were still on this trip, news reached them of the collapse of J. Cook and Company, which is what set off that multi-year international financial depression we know of as the Panic of 1873. So during most of the 1870s, the economy was just limping along. And that gave the officers time to reevaluate their options. And by 1878, the Chicago and Northwestern no longer saw that link to the Northern Pacific to be their best investment. Instead, they saw greater opportunity heading west to the Black Hills, where gold had been confirmed in 1874. And in order to achieve that goal of tracks to the Black Hills, they needed someone to establish a suitable route, and that is where Charles Wood Irish comes in. The officers hired him to do what in his diaries he called the Dakota trip. Now, some background about Irish and Iowa City. His father, Frederick, came to the Iowa City area in 1839, and he built a cabin, which was later expanded. This picture isn't of that first cabin. But within that cabin, that's where the area commissioners decided where to build the territorial capital, and then decided on the design for that capital. So his father was kind of instrumental in getting things established and in getting railroads to come to Iowa City. And that cabin is actually now the dining room of the Irish Hamilton Turner House on Cedar Street in Iowa City, making that room the oldest surviving structure in Iowa City. And Irish's father had a maritime past, and he was known as Captain Irish, and the Captain Irish Parkway in Iowa City is named for him. Now, while our surveyor, Charles Wood Irish, was born on the island of Manhattan, he moved with his family as a toddler to Iowa City, so he kind of grew up in that cabin that's now somebody's dining room. And his siblings were also quite accomplished, especially his brother J.P., who was a legislator and a judge in early Iowa. And it was J.P. who added language to the Iowa Constitution that gave women rights within the state of Iowa as well. And I discovered that fact while researching for the Frank Lloyd Wright Stockman House. So it's always fun when my research worlds collide with each other. And JP also ran a lot of newspapers in both Iowa and California. Now, by the time Irish had been hired to determine that route that went from Minnesota out to Deadwood. He had a very impressive set of credentials. He'd been hired by the great John Blair, the father of many Midwestern rail projects, to run a line from the Mississippi River in eastern Iowa across the state to Council Bluffs on the Missouri River. And that was the first line to span the state of Iowa and is the portion that was folded into the very first transcontinental railroad. He also helped survey for the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe, which is the project he was finishing up when he began this Dakota project. Letters home talked of his aspiration that this Dakota line could position him to do work for the Northern Pacific, that transcontinental that was under construction. It was the prestigious project of the era. And he succeeded and was asked to work on the Northern Pacific, but due to illness, he hadn't been able to actually accept that offer. He moved away from rail surveys just a few years after this Dakota project when President Cleveland appointed him to the position of Surveyor General for the state of Nevada. And he was known as General Irish, but it wasn't a military title. It referred to his time as Surveyor General. Cleveland also appointed him to the position of Chief of the U.S. Irrigation Bureau, which required him to live in D.C. for a time. And when that post ended, he returned to Nevada, surveying claims in the gold fields until he died there in 1904. Now, Irish spent a lot of time during this project away from home, but frequent letters kept the family very connected, as did multiple visits where Mrs. Irish went out to Dakota Territory to spend extended time with her husband. And there were a few times that their daughters, who were adults at the time, came out there as well. So I'm going to briefly introduce them because they play an important part of this story, but they are also pretty amazing women in their own right. Mrs. Irish was as comfortable in these camps as she was in her nice home in Iowa City. And towards the end of the surveying project, she was stranded with her husband in the new town of Pierre when the snows of the hard winter set in and blocked the trains from running in from the east. And some of the more poignant passages involve Mrs. Irish and her safety fears, not from the drunken desperados that were roaming the streets of Fort Pierre, nor the dangerous weather, but instead her fear of fire in these flimsy little frontier towns after several very close calls. Their daughter, Lizzie, turned about 23 at the beginning of the project, and she was independent and had a strong personality in an era when this wasn't necessarily encouraged for women. And among her many accomplishments were positions with the U.S. Mint and Wells Fargo while living in California. And she was also the business manager of many of the newspapers run by her uncle, J.P. When she returned to Iowa from California, she opened and ran the Irish Business College, which educated about 12,000 men and women in business skills. And she ran it until she closed the school to retire at the age of 84. She lived to be 96. Now, Lizzie's younger sister, Ruth, shown here on the right, was about 20 when this project began, and she was also independent, but maybe a little bit more traditional than her sister Lizzie. She was a teacher and was one until she married at age 28, but remained active as a writer and artist throughout her life, including at least one, maybe several articles that were published in the Annals of Iowa. And there is an extraordinary letter that Irish wrote to Ruth after she had suffered a terrible heartbreak. So basically, this Victorian era father told his adult daughter that she was smart enough and capable enough to have a rich and fulfilling life without marriage, but that if she did decide to marry someday, to wait for someone smart enough to accept her intellect. He told her specifically not to marry just for the sake of marrying. And that is really quite amazing for this era. These three women were the keepers of Irish's copious records, and they kept diaries and letters of themselves. And there are several collections in Iowa, both in Des Moines and in Iowa City, as a result of the work of these three women. So now that we have a sense of who Irish and his family were, I'm going to share some vignettes from the project, each of which bring in other aspects of the larger story. And the first one is about Big Mike's woodyard on Old Fort George Island, which for a time became Irish's ranch. Now, in a June 1879 letter home, just a few months into this project, Irish had written from that innocence that comes without hindsight. He was about 45 years old at this point and was probably kind of feeling his age a little. And in this letter, he declared that he would not for any pay, take on any more winter work. Now, of course, this project began midwinter and went through 2 more full winters, including one of the worst on record. And for this first full winter, they'd be working near the Missouri River. Now, the survey began in Tracy, Minnesota, with the ultimate goal being Deadwood in the northern Black Hills. And these 2 boxes show where they'd be focusing most of their winter work. The lower box shows the area along Medicine Creek, where Irish believed was going to be the best opportunity from getting down across the high plains to the east, down those broken bluffs to the Missouri itself. And the upper box was going to be their other area of focus. And that would include finding a place to actually cross the Missouri River. And the red dot there in the kind of right smack dab in the middle is the general location of Fort George Island. Now, that island sat near where Medicine Creek emptied into the Missouri, so it was a very convenient location for their winter work. Now, the island itself no longer exists. It disappeared under the waters of the Missouri when it was dammed in the mid-20th century. But at the time of Irish's work, it was a nicely wooded island. And Irish made arrangements to rent Big Mike's woodyard for the winter. Big Mike's log house was going to serve as lodgings for the crew and their headquarters. And he paid Big Mike $18.66 for rent, which is about $470 today. And we're going to talk more about woodyards in a little bit. But first, this photo was taken on a midwinter day at approximately the location of the northern end of that island. So the men would have seen a similar view as they were settling in for the winter, though the river wouldn't have been quite that wide back in 1880. Now, that log house was a lovely respite against the elements and a very nice upgrade over their canvas tents. And the crew set about making it their own, focusing first on building bunks enough for everybody. And in one letter home, Irish made some detailed drawings so that his family could envision the space. Along the west wall, so the wall that was along the river, that is where all the bunks for the men were. Each bunk was 7.5 feet long, 4.5 feet wide, and was shared by 2 men. The east wall held Irish's bunk. His gun was mounted above his bed, and beneath his bunk was what he called the big box. And he has it elevated up off of the ground because that's where he stored all of his important papers, and keeping it elevated protected it a little bit from the elements. And beside the bunk was a cupboard. Below the cupboard were 2 water barrels and a table. And then he described how they kept warm aside from 2 stoves, one for cooking and one for heat. He told his family, "We have 3 pair of heavy blankets and 2 buffalo robes each, and some of the men have blankets of their own, so you see we are well fixed." for cold weather. However, while they were nicely situated for the winter, this lovely sanctuary did not end up lasting as long as they had hoped it would, which means now we need to talk about wood yards and what led Irish and his crew to be booted out of their comfortable log home. Big Mike's woodyard was one of many such locations along the river where private citizens cut down trees and chopped them into cordwood, which was then sold to those passing riverboats. However, many of these sellers were pilfering timber that was on a reservation and belonged to the local Dakota and Lakota people. And Captain William Doherty, the agent at Crow Creek River Agency at Fort Thompson, knew that these wood sellers were clearly in violation of the law. However, he also knew that most of the goods carried by these steamboats are what supplied the various military posts up and down the river. So he knew that it was important to keep the steamboat supplied with fuel along the way, and a riverboat could burn through about a cord of wood an hour. So they were practically insatiable. And as Doherty astutely noted in his annual report to the Commissioner of Indian Affairs for 1879, the necessity of the wood still exists, but not the necessity of the white men. Instead, he proposed that the Dakota chop the wood which they illegally owned and thus reap the rewards of selling it to the steamboats at the same price that the white men did. The white men, he said, could find themselves another job. And the same complaint was mentioned by other agents as well. So there was some trouble brewing. And on February 7th of 1880, Irish noted in his diary that Big Mike had returned, agitated and making threats. And Irish wondered, what can ail the brute? Well, what ailed the brute is that Captain Doherty wanted to burn Big Mike out for stealing wood and profiting from it. But worse than that, Big Mike was convinced that Irish was in on it. Threats were made all around, and in the end, Irish and his men were forced to relocate to a camp just upstream along Medicine Creek. Soon, Big Mike came and dismantled his buildings, carried off the bits and pieces, and Doherty came, burned the rest of the property, and confiscated all of the cordwood. And probably related to this very significant downturn in the comfort of their winter lodging, Irish uncovered an attempted mutiny among his crew, which he settled swiftly by firing one person and putting several others on notice. And that is how Irish and his crew lost their cozy winter lodge and were forced back out into canvas tents in February in Dakota. And it was the only time during the entire 2.5-year project where they were not living in canvas tents unless they were at an overnight hotel kind of thing while running errands. Fortunately, it was not a particularly harsh winter, this first one, though there was still plenty of snow and cold. In fact, the day before Big Mike had originally shown up and demanded that they vacate his lodge, a portion of the crew had been caught in a heavy snowstorm on the high plains above Medicine Creek. And due to strong winds, they hadn't been able to actually set up their canvas tent. So instead, they just kind of pegged it down on its side and then tucked their beds up underneath it. They slept through the night and woke up kind of buried in snow. And Irish made a lot of drawings in his letters, and he included this scene. So we have the 4 men buried in the snow under their pegged down tent, and he included the fact that they had pointed the wagon tongue in the direction that they would need to go the next morning, since they knew everything would be just everything looking the same under all that snow. Now, by now, the surveyors were ready to do some preliminary explorations west of the Missouri River. However, that land was off limits with one exception. Now, of course, westward expansion has a very uncomfortable and dark side that it deserves its own honest and healing and humbling attention that is well beyond the scope of my work here. But much of the land that Irish and his team were marking for the railroad had been off limits or remained so at this time, or had just been opened up. So these maps show how much and how quickly the native populations lost land in a pretty short period of time. And Irish's work was taking place less than 3 years after the Little Bighorn. And during the years when the Great Plains tribes were staging their last attempts to hold on to their ancestral lands. And in 1880, when Irish was going to need to find that path to Deadwood, he'd be required to cross Lakota land. Now, in 1876, after that 1874 confirmation of gold in the Black Hills, an uneasy agreement with the Lakota did allow whites to cross the Great Sioux Reservation on a narrow road between Fort Pierre on the Missouri River and Deadwood in the Black Hills. And there were stops every so often that ranged in services from simply places to swap animals to rustic ranches that offered food and lodging. And each of the little yellow highlighted areas along that path are one of those, either a ranch or an animal swapping spot. However, venturing off of that road was strictly forbidden, and that, of course, included poking around to see where it might be suitable to put a railroad. In fact, Irish and another crew member had been turned back in March of 1880 when they had tried to scout around a little bit along the Missouri River on the west side where the Cheyenne River emptied into the Missouri. And they were stopped by some Lakota who told them to go back on the east side of the river. And that was their warning that if they tried it again, it might not end so well. However, Irish was being paid to find this route across that land, and so he decided to try the legal route. And that meant following the road from Fort Pierre out to Deadwood, and that would allow him to do a preliminary exploratory trip. So in March of 1880, he and two of his men, as well as a local Fort Pierre businessman, undertook a trip along the Fort Pierre to Deadwood road just so we could kind of get a sense of things. And they stopped at the stage ranches along the way and asked questions of their hosts and their fellow travelers just to get a sense of the landscape and climate, that kind of thing. And as they began their trip west, Irish kept a special journal aside from his normal diary. And later in the trip, he wrote, "Several Indians on horseback maneuvered, suspicious of us. So far, we've been closely watched by several mounted Indians. Today we found on the ridge marks of a survey made not long before, and I suspect it is the work of the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul engineers." Now, the Chicago and Milwaukee was a rival to the Chicago and Northwestern, though frenemies was probably a better description of their relationship. And stories about how these two companies tried to thwart each other at every turn, but then would be head-scratchingly cooperative with each other at others, can be very entertaining when you get into them. But at this point in time, they were both trying to get to the Missouri and beyond it. The timing of this trip, however, was absolutely awful. On the first day, they got as far as the Lance Creek station when a multi-day storm set in, and travelers were crowded into a small cabin, which was very cold and comfortless. And at sunset on the second day, men began coming in from the west, some of which were badly frozen, and four of them had gone 48 hours without food or water. And this photo was taken about 30 years later, but it does give you a general sense of what a stage ranch may have looked like. After 2 days being stuck in the storm, they were able to move on. And they saw many frozen cattle along the way. And they reached Waldron's bull camp and found that some of Waldron's bulls had been among the casualties of the storm. And that is how the heavy mining equipment made it from the Missouri River out to the Black Hills. These bull teams would pull that heavy stuff across that trail. Now, this photo was taken in the area where that bull camp was, just so you have a sense of how wide and open it was. Now, the next day, they continued west, crossing between Grindstone Buttes and reaching Dead Man's Creek Ranch. And Irish noted that they had received wonderful hospitality at Waldron's, but almost hostile hospitality at Dead Man's Creek. And the next day, they finally reached their destination, which was Smith's Crossing on the Cheyenne River. And in a letter home, Irish made this drawing of the Black Hills area, which I kind of rotated so it's properly oriented. And Smith's Ranch is there where that square is. And for a couple of days, Irish, the ranch owner, and a local hunter explored up and down the Cheyenne River, looking for suitable places where they'd be able to cross the Cheyenne. And Irish noted that it was very far from pleasant to do this work. It was very rugged terrain, and the weather was very cold. They had no problem whatsoever with any of the Lakota that were keeping close watch on them. He frequently mentioned that they could see men mounted on ponies keeping an eye on them, but they never had any trouble with the Lakota. However, a man named McCann's came to the house where the group was staying and struck Mr. Sherwood, that businessman from Fort Pierre, over the head with a pistol, hurting him badly. Now, there was no explanation for why Sherwood was attacked, but the only problem they had on this entire trip was with a white man. But this semi-clandestine scout had given him a glimpse of the terrain that would complicate the route west, but the landscape, of course, wasn't going to be their only hurdle. In the meantime, simply finding a place to cross the Missouri, much less get beyond it, was going to be their focus for much of the coming summer. And that earlier wood pilfering problem along the Missouri was not the only issue between the two cultures, of course. And this next vignette I'm going to share is about being able to conduct the survey west of the Missouri River. Now, John Blunt was the chief engineer of this new railroad, and he was very hands-on and was frequently in camp for days at a time. He was comfortable sleeping on the open prairie, and he was also the officer who took Irish's reports and maps and recommendations back to the boardroom in Chicago. And he and Irish had a good relationship, both personally and professionally. And Mr. Blunt was also the person charged with the task of setting up the negotiations that would allow the survey to happen west of the Missouri. However, Irish noted in one of his diary entries that Blunt was afraid to do the work anymore. And as a result, Blunt stayed behind in the survey camp doing surveying work, delegating to Irish the task of arranging for these negotiations. And for 2 weeks, Irish covered hundreds of miles, going back and forth between various fort and camp locations, arranging for meetings and discussions, and keeping Blunt in the loop. And it's worth noting that while Irish was looking to the west and dealing with the diplomatic crisis that was blooming there, the crew was still responsible for ensuring that all of their work to the east was properly marked and ready for the graders who were very rapidly approaching the Missouri River. His wife was also already in camp with him at this point, and his daughters arrived on the 1st of August. So this was a time when Irish had his entire family with him, but he was often having to be away from camp. And Irish knew that this critical and touchy situation would determine whether his employment continued as well as his entire crew. He was also very aware that the Lakota did not want to grant access for a survey to happen. And after one of his visits to the Cheyenne River Agency, he noted that he had found the Indians angered very much. Now, on August 12th, he received a telegram telling him that the company officers were on their way. So the next day, he and his family headed up to Fort Bennett at the Cheyenne River Agency. The next day, Irish and another helped convince Agent Leonard Love to send runners out to the various Lakota camps, asking them to come in for discussions. However, it began to rain, and it kept raining for several days. And Irish noted that it was raining so heavy that the natives could not come in to Fort Bennett to have these discussions. When the rain finally let up on the morning of the 17th, the Lakota were able to reach the fort and the talks were able to begin. Early discussions yielded no results, and he expressed feeling a little bit discouraged and tired out. After a short break, however, talks resumed and an agreement was reached at about midnight as August 18th began. So Irish could now conduct a survey west of the Missouri River, and his crew at this point would include about 30 Lakota members. Now, before we move on, we're going to jump ahead a few months to an event that took place in early December. In one of his notebooks, Irish had recorded some of the direct participants in the negotiations, which included Lakota headmen, railroad officers, himself, officers at the agency, and an interpreter. Now, 3.5 months later, the Lakota headmen were traveling to Washington, D.C. to formalize this agreement. But at 2:30 a.m. on December 9th, just east of New Ulm, Minnesota, that train carrying about 330 passengers, including the Lakota delegation, derailed. And at least three of the participants in the negotiations, Rattling Rib, White Swan, and Agent Love, are listed in articles about the event. And at least one of those Lakota was not in the least bit impressed. He had never seen a train of cars before he had reached a pier, and after the accident, he expressed his disgust in the white man's mode of traveling in strong terms. So we're going to jump back to the summer immediately after the negotiations. This photo was taken just after that agreement had been reached, and the crew is camped near the mouth of the Bad River, which is immediately south of Fort Pierre today. And we get a sense of how the men were living day to day as they conducted their work. And the caption here, which Irish himself wrote, says July 1880. But I believe this photo was taken on August 22nd, 1881, after they were allowed to camp on the west side of Missouri. And the date that Irish had noted in his diary that a photographer had come to camp. And there under that little red bracket is where Irish, his wife and daughters, and a favorite horse are all posed together there. Now from here, the crew began their work west of the river, and that's where we're going to leave these vignettes and transition to a research problem. Because finding the exact location of one particular campsite went from a mild curiosity for me to, well, kind of a near obsession. And it took me a couple of years off and on to actually solve it. Because during the research for this project, I went to each and every camp location that he mentioned, and there were only two that I was not able to identify. One I still haven't found. This is the other. And the reason I wanted to find it is it's where Irish and his crew were caught by that October 1880 blizzard that kicked off the hard winter. So while looking for it, I first, of course, isolated clues from the diaries or letters. They crossed over the head of Medicine Creek. Easy enough. Oh, yes, and there's a Medicine Creek on the west side of the Missouri, not to be confused with the Medicine Creek on the east side of the Missouri. The next day, they scouted as far as the forks of the Cheyenne, where the Belle Fourche River empties into the Cheyenne. Again, easy enough. Then they came back from the forks, camping at an unknown creek they named Buck Creek in honor of a deer or an antelope that they had shot for dinner. And this begins the problems that would plague me for the next couple of years. As long as they followed the Bad River, the tributaries already had white names on the maps. Those names remain to this day, with one exception. Irish used those names in his document, so it was easy to follow the crew's progress. But once they moved northward over the divide, away from the Bad River and towards the Cheyenne, Irish and his crew named creeks and buttes and pinnacles and all the other landmarks whatever they wanted. And that usually meant honoring family or friends or one of themselves or some animal that had either crossed their path or provided their meal. So clues about these features had to be relied upon instead of their names. And soon after the men crossed over that divide away from the head of Medicine Creek, we have our first mention of the Gap Creek Camp, which they reached by following their other self-named Buck Creek until it emptied into Gap Creek, which he said was in an area of heavy canyons. Now, a reasonable person would have said, okay, that's close enough, but I kept digging. And during post-pandemic research at the South Dakota Historical Society in Pierre, I mentioned my dilemma to their resident map expert, and she also became intrigued. So she started digging and bringing out more and more maps and piling them up on the table in front of me. And they were maps of all varieties, made over the course of about 250 years. They were fascinating. And the specific area I needed detail about became rather conspicuous for its lack of detail on map after map. Fortunately, I'm very thorough. I was afraid I'd miss something. So I looked at each and every map that came out, and eventually this treasure landed on the table. And it was also the one filed with the U.S. House of Representatives. And it shows Irish's proposed route through this area, which combined with those diary clues at least gave me an even more narrowed route to try and find Gap Creek. So now we're going to go to the October blizzard. On October 13th, 1880, 4 of Irish's men were sick, a situation he blamed on the villainous water they were drinking here in this area. And at 2 p.m. that day, it was 80 degrees with a strong wind, and Irish sent 2 of his crew members back to a supply camp that was about 20 miles to the southeast to bring back provisions. They were starting to run low. A rain developed, and by midnight it was snowing. So again, it was 80 degrees at 2 p.m. and it was snowing by midnight. And throughout the 14th, all the men could really do was hunker down in their tents. And at the end of that first day, Irish closed his diary with, "The sick are worse and the camp comfortless. We have all we can do to keep warm in this gale." And that storm raged for several more days. And that time yielded really interesting diary entries and letters home, including how Irish had the Lakota team members show the rest of them how to convert their canvas tents into teepees to better withstand the blizzard winds and to hold in what little heat they were able to produce. But in order to find this campsite, it became clear that I needed to find the actual maps Irish had drawn of this area, which had been off limits not just because of the pandemic, but because they had been deemed too fragile for research. Now, as soon as the special collections libraries reopened in Iowa City, I set up a new research appointment because I had some other things I wanted to look at. And knowing how much I wanted to see those fragile maps, the lead conservationist cleared her morning to work with me. And we determined map by map whether something was strong enough to individually look at. And I should also mention that when I set up this appointment, I'd mentioned that the particular map that I really, really, really wanted to see had not been found during an earlier research trip. And so that led her to dig a little bit deeper, and she found it. It had been kind of misfiled. So she brought it out, and the label on the box read, Mouth of the Big Cheyenne to Forks of the Big Cheyenne, undated. Well, I could now tell them within like a week when that map had been drawn. And if you look closely in the lower left corner, you can see Irish's professional stamp there. Now, I held my breath as we pulled that map out of the box, and I fully anticipated that all the answers to my remaining questions were just going to fall out onto the table when we unrolled that map. So we very carefully unfurled it, and it was several feet long. And there it finally was, Irish's interpretation of the area I had started to call the mystery area. And it shows the whole stretch from the Missouri River to the Forks. And this is the map that finally allowed me to find the Gap Creek campsite. So Irish and his men were here in this area with Irish and a portion of the crew at that surveying camp in the upper left, and that supply camp is that dot in the lower right. Now, many of the landmark clues from the diary were labeled on this map, but not all of the landmarks were labeled. In fact, I was a little bit dejected because there wasn't just a big blinking neon sign with an arrow pointing right to the Gap Creek site. In fact, there was no line labeled Gap Creek at all. And without confirmation of that waterway, I knew it was going to be very difficult to ever locate that campsite. But then I noticed a small collection of squares on the map. And those squares were Irish's method of identifying a campsite. So there I had it. I had the Gap Creek campsite, meaning that the waterway beside it was Gap Creek, including some of its tributaries. At which point I got overly optimistic again, thinking it was going to be very easy to overlay Irish's map onto a modern topographical map, and the exact location would stand out like that neon light I had been hoping to find. Now, fortunately, my husband had some pretty good map reading skills, and he wanted to see what he could do. So while I worked on more research and the writing part, he set to work with the list of clues from the diaries and letters and these new maps. And it was a long process, mostly involving eliminating candidates. But one afternoon, he did find it, and Irish's drawing and modern topographical maps overlaid absolutely perfectly once we found the actual correct spot. So we then headed back out to western South Dakota along with a friend and his drone. And we drove as close as we could get without trespassing. I had established relationships with many of the ranch owners out here, but this particular ranch owner was very difficult to locate because he doesn't live there anymore. So we only got as close as we could without trespassing. But at this point, we entered the coordinates for the campsite into the drone and sent it up. So this photo was taken from we are standing on the ridge at about the tip of that arrow, and we are facing north, and the camp location is there in that oval several miles away from us. And it's showing the terrain that Irish had described as very broken country with heavy canyons. The Cheyenne River can be seen there at the top, and the forks where the Belle Fourche comes in is at the upper left, but it's not visible in the photo. Now we have to reorient ourselves because the drone has flown a couple of miles to the north from where we're standing on that ridge, and the photo is looking back south towards us, and it's capturing the campsite, which is there in that rectangle. And it's here in this protected little valley that Irish and his men were trapped for about a week by that first blizzard of the hard winter. But I don't want you to envision it with this pretty green and lushness of June, but with howling winds and blowing snow and bitterly cold temperatures. Now, after seeing that photo, it's not uncommon for people to say, what was he thinking? Was he crazy for trying to put a railroad there? Well, that little valley isn't where he wanted to actually put the railroad. It was simply a nice protected spot to set up their campsite. On Irish's map, he had identified two good options for getting through that broken country and down to the Cheyenne. And we're going to look at the northernmost option, specifically what I kind of started calling the S curve, that would have allowed him to get from one ridge to another and then get those tracks down to the river. And this whole area is north of modern Wall, South Dakota. So if you've ever been to Wall Drug, this is the area to the north. Now, this photo is looking kind of east-southeast, and the arrow there is showing where we're standing and sent the drone up. And you can see the relatively flat area that Irish had identified to get those tracks through, needing just a few gullies here and there. And then as this ridge continued on, it would have crossed the modern road that comes up out of Wall, and then picked up a creek valley that would have taken it straight down to the river. And from there, he intended to cross near the forks and then follow the valley of the Belle Fourche River up to Sturgis, which they honestly believed was going to be the metropolis of the Black Hills. They really didn't think that Rapid City was going to develop into anything at this point in time. However, once they left the Gap Creek camp after that October blizzard, they never did return to this area to complete their work. Now, the hard winter was truly, truly horrific. And while Irish tried to keep the work going through the first few months of blizzards and sub-zero temperatures, the survey was finally called to a halt in early February, at which point Irish and his wife were trapped in Pierre because the trains were no longer running. They then waited out the winter living in the new depot in Pierre, so they lived on the second floor there. And in late March, a great ice dam on the Missouri River broke just south of this area, and the backed up waters scoured both Pierre that we're looking at and Fort Pierre on the other side of the river and caused additional significant damage downstream. At Yankton, South Dakota, it wiped out much of the steamboat fleet. And then down at Vermilion, which had been built in the river bottoms, it completely obliterated Vermilion. It created a new channel for the Missouri River in that area. And when they rebuilt Vermilion, it is up on top of the bluff today, and that is because of the ice dam that broke at the end of the hard winter. Now, Irish's account of that ice dam and flood are fantastic. He wrote a very long letter home to his daughters with a lot of detail about that event. Now, it would be almost another 25 years before the Chicago and Northwestern made use of Irish's route work west of the Missouri River. And when they did build the route, Rapid City was their destination now, not Deadwood. And there are many factors as to why, including shifting economic incentives. The bigger reason, however, is that while the railroad had acquired permission to survey across Lakota land, that had not included permission to actually build across Lakota land. And the officers said, you know what, we're going to find other routes rather than fight that. And when they were finally able to build in the early 1900s, that agreement hadn't necessarily been a real agreement. It was part of the Dawes Act that kind of reallocated most of the Great Sioux Reservation. So one last thing I want to mention is why the book is called We Suffered Much. After all, there's kind of a semi-unwritten rule that you don't want a negative book title. But the phrase "we suffered much" appeared frequently within the diary entries, and each of those shown here have either that exact phrase or a very similar lament. They were conducting their work in all weather conditions, from temperatures well below zero to well above 100, air dry in the winter and humid in the summer, and every type of precipitation. And they were also living in canvas tents most of that time, including the very worst of the winter weather. There was terrible water, there was illness, there was a death, an attempted mutiny, horses that got away again and again. There was a horse that accidentally killed itself, something that the crew grieved so deeply that they held a funeral for that horse. There were multiple accidental shootings, and oh my goodness, there were mosquitoes. But what it really is an adventure book and gives a look at a rarely told portion of the history of railroad development in the late 19th century. So I've shared just a little bit of what Irish and his men experienced over the 2 years of their work. And that story is told in We Suffered Much. I also have The Beautiful Snow. And Lizzie and Ruth, the daughters, in late July of 1880, they got on a steamboat in Sioux City, Iowa, and took that steamboat all the way up the Missouri River to Pier, and they wrote a narrative of their adventure. And in the most recent Quarterly Journal of the South Dakota Historical Society's magazine, the article there called A Trip to Dakota is that narrative that Ruth and Lizzie put together that I expanded out, adding context for what was going on and photographs and that sort of thing. So if you're interested in what Lizzie and Ruth had to say about their trip, you can get it in that particular edition of the journal. And then when this coming summer will be my 5th year leading tours at the Stockman House in Mason City. And when I started doing tours, they knew I like to do research and writing. And so they asked me to put together a book about the Stockman House. And that has been available in the gift shop since April and can also be bought through Shop Iowa if you're interested in Frank Lloyd Wright. So thank you very much. If we have time for questions, I would love to see what I can do.
Oh, you bet. Well, thank you so much, Cindy. We have time. We're kind of right about 1 o'clock, but I always like to have time for at least one question. So we'll do at least one. We'll see.
And as a reminder, if you had a question, feel free to drop that in the Q&A section there at the bottom. If we don't get to your question, we might be able to connect you with Cindy as well afterwards, to make sure that she's got her contact information there, and so you can send those questions to her as well. I think, the question that I'll pull here is one is about your research, actually. Watching, I was really inspired myself, hearing your joy and excitement of finding some of these things as you dug through archives and knowing what you found and then being surprised by what you found. And so this question kind of touches on that and just asks, can you talk about some of those moments when you found something really incredible or surprising in the dark documents or archives and what that meant as you kind of reframed and thought about your project?
Well, seeing that map that allowed me to finally identify Gap Creek was such a wonderful moment that the lead conservationist there um, asked me to pose with the map, and she took a picture of it because it meant something to her that her work was meaning something to somebody else. That was an amazing moment. I've had several in sitting at the microfilm machines, looking at newspaper reports. Um, that can get really tedious, and you can kind of end up in a trance. And every now and then, something that puts a bunch of pieces together will walk in front of you. And those moments are the rewards for how tedious research can sometimes be. But there's always those nuggets that are the little breadcrumbs that let you figure out what was really going on, what's the context, what were the details. Um, and um, yeah, the maps were big. I'm thinking of a handful of newspaper articles from South Dakota from during the hard winter that really kind of answered a lot of questions. The descriptions of the ongoing efforts of the railroad companies to clear the snow, um, and some of the descriptive storytelling that was there. Those kind of excitements are kind of what keep a researcher going. Uh,
Oh, absolutely. I think that's great. And really, I love the way that you also help us see the team it takes to do this kind of research. You mentioning the preservation, the lead preservation and conservation folks that they were searching too, that it takes a village to do this research, even though you're the one flipping through pages or sitting at the microfilm, there's that incredible group of professionals behind the research that is also helping to equip us. And I know that
yes,
those folks are so important. I
yes.
love the way you share that. We'll ask one more question and then we'll wrap up. I wonder if you could talk a little bit. I love the way too that as you're talking, we hear a little bit of, I was working on this project, you talk about the beautiful snow and you had that reference to him, and then you moved on, but then you came back and you mentioned the Stockman House. You had done some work in and also found some connections. So how do you think as a researcher, right, from Ingalls to Irish to the Stockman House, how are these really kind of different projects also so connected in the work that you're doing?
And those are some of those moments. In fact, I even wrote a blog post about research worlds colliding. Um, I when I when I was researching for the Stockman House, Mrs. Stockman, who was the one interested in art and architecture, this was her. She was the one who kind of spurred on the let's design a house with Frank Lloyd Wright. She was very, very involved in women's suffrage. In fact, she was one of Iowa's top ladies. And when I was researching about her and flipping through her scrapbook, she kept newspaper scrapbook of any article that talked about um, efforts for women's suffrage, getting women the vote. And as I was flipping through the clippings in her scrapbook, that is where I saw the article about J.P. Irish having been the one who introduced into the Iowa State Constitution the giving women, striking the word male so that women were included. And it was one of those mind-blowing, oh my goodness, there's a connection in her world to my surveyor's brother who is connected to the Ingalls. It just blows my mind that everything is so connected. And I talk about, there's that game, 7 Degrees of Separation from Kevin Bacon. And I kind of joke that if you look hard enough, you can find connections to everything. So yeah, and Iowa, Minnesota, South Dakota, they're all geographically kind of similar. And that was one of the things I joke a little bit about Irish is I tell people that he's a little like Forrest Gump in that he ran into everybody who was everybody. When he would write in his diaries and letters and mention names, when I was doing research, I think there were only 4 of the people he mentioned that I wasn't able to find more extensive biographical information kept on him, on these people, meaning they were enough of somebody that the Historical Society had folders about them. So it's fun to, without looking for the connections, to stumble upon the connections.
Oh, absolutely. The joy of research is finding those unexpected but delightful connections. We could talk all day, but I want to recognize our time here and want to thank you. I'll bring this webinar to a close and thank everyone for joining us today. And we really want to send one more thank you to you, Cindy, for this really interesting and engaging conversation. It's been such a delight to have you. We hope everyone will sign up for the Iowa History 101 webinars that take place throughout the year. There are many great stories to tell in the upcoming month. For more information or to register for future webinars in this series or to watch recordings, check out our website at history.iowa.gov. And if you're looking to learn more Iowa history, you can find and watch over 120 recorded webinars from our past 101 programs on our Iowa History YouTube channel. We look forward to seeing you virtually for our next Iowa History 101 webinar, The History of the Iowa Farm, on February 12th. Thank you again for joining us today and have a great afternoon, everyone.